Welcome back to Venture into the Vault. Can you believe it? A new episode! Now, as you may know, I grew up drawing comic book superheroes for around 20 years. But around 20 years ago, I switched to wanting to paint book covers. Sure, okay, the delineation isn't as clear-cut as that. I mean, I dabbled with paints before then, I continued to draw after that, but that point in time marked a transition. And I've worked in different media and different styles ever since. So before I tried my hand at serious painting, I went into a used bookstore and looked around to see what kind of book covers would I like to paint? What inspires me? And that's when I found this, The Reign of Wizardry. Now, I went online and I looked around and I found out that this was painted by a man named Frank Frazetta. Now, I don't remember if that name was familiar to me at the time, but I had to look up his other work to see, well, who is this and what does he do? And when I saw his paintings, I said, that's the van guy. You see, I swear I saw his paintings airbrushed on the sides of vans in the 70s. I would soon find out that everyone else was calling him Frazetta, and they would refer to him as the Molly Hatchet guy. Now that's because they can't pronounce names, and 3 of his paintings were used for Molly Hatchet album covers in the 70s. Well, I wanted to get collections of his work to study, and I was in luck because Walden Books was carrying brand new hardcover collections of his work, starting with Icon from 1998, Legacy from 1999, and they were advertising the upcoming book, Testament, from 2001. And at that same time, Frank Frazetta was opening up a museum in the Poconos to show off his original work. Now, I read all of these books from cover to cover, and I sketched every single painting in all 3 of them. Let me show you some of his work. In 2003, a documentary about him came out called Painting with Fire. Then we started to get books about the in-depth study of how he put his masterpieces together, starting with Rough Work and Sketchbook 1 and Sketchbook 2. And then in 2008, we got the Blu-ray release of his 1983 film he made with Ralph Bakshi, Fire and Ice. Now there I was in 2009, sitting in my work truck in front of an abandoned Italian ice shop, reading a news story on the internet about Frank Frazetta Jr. breaking into his father's museum in the Poconos with a bulldozer and stealing the paintings. What was going on? Well, just 5 months later, Frank Frazetta was in my local newspaper because he was right up the road at Lee Memorial Hospital, where I work now, being pronounced dead. Pioneering fantasy artist Frank Frazetta died Monday in Fort Myers. He had been out to dinner with his daughters on Sunday, but suffered a stroke at his Boca Grande home. And later that night, he was taken to Lee Memorial Hospital. So is that the end of the story? No, we haven't even begun. Let me take you back to the beginning. Frank Frazetta was born on February 9, 1928, in Brooklyn, New York. He was a child prodigy, and at 8 years old, he was enrolled in the Brooklyn Academy of Fine Arts. By the age of 16, he became a professional comic book artist. Here's some of his comic work. And he would make newspaper comic strips. He didn't start painting professionally until he was 34 years old, starting with this first Tarzan paperback book cover. Around the same time, he started working on Hollywood movie posters, Now all of these paintings were in watercolor. In 1966, he worked out a special deal where he could get his original art back from the publishers, and he switched to oil paints and started with the first Conan paperback book cover, which became the highest selling paperback book of all time. And that's when everything changed. The sales of those books skyrocketed. People would go into the bookstores just to rip off the covers and steal them. Artists studied his work and tried to emulate it. The entire genre of fantasy art changed from that point forward. Frank was told by publishers, paint anything you want. Bring in any paintings you have lying around. We'll buy everything and find books to put them on. It didn't matter what the books were. They sold because of the covers. In the mid-1970s, Frank's wife Ellie started a poster print company out of their home to sell copies of his paintings to the masses. And a deal was struck with Bantam Books to put out a series of books collecting his artwork called The Fantastic Art of Frank Frazetta. In 1976, American Artist magazine featured his painting, Death Dealer, on the cover, which was the first time this magazine ever featured an illustrator. And that's when things went big time. Clint Eastwood, George Lucas, Sylvester Stallone, Bo Derek, and more came out to meet him and buy his artwork. This 1978 issue of Van World magazine features an interview with Frank about how he became the most popular artist to have his work copied onto the sides of vans. I knew he was the van guy. Starting in 1982, thyroid issues put Frank into an early retirement in his 50s. And he started to work with Ralph Bakshi on the animated film Fire and Ice, talked about in this magazine and this one. In 1988, he drew the cover to Mike Thibodeau's Last of the Viking Heroes Summer Special #1. Now, what is the significance of this? Well, in an earlier video, I touched upon my lifelong pursuit of the Flaming Vader, but I didn't tell the full story. When I was a kid, there was a yearly fair at our local civic center, and I remember the sounds of those early arcades with Pac-Man, and the games where we could win prizes. My favorite of which were these jumbo shoelaces that I would collect by the dozen. But another thing you could win was an 8-inch by 8-inch mirror in a piece of cardboard, usually featuring your favorite band. I wanted one with Darth Vader. But back then there wasn't as much Star Wars merchandise as there is now, believe it or not. But I did find one with a different type of a robot from space with a flaming sword. It said his name was the Flaming Vader, and it was for a band called Y&T. Anyways, I won this mirror and I had it on my wall throughout the 80s. Well, not really. You see, my memory was playing tricks on me. It turns out I was confusing an advertisement on the back of my very first comic book for a Flaming Vader poster and something else. I eventually got that poster and saw that it was created by Michael Thibodeau in 1978, 10 years before his collaboration with Frank Frazetta on The Last of the Viking Heroes. So what was that mirror? It was this one, for the Y&T album In Rock We Trust. And it has a different robot on it, and it's not even a mirror. This carnival glass was the last and hardest thing I ever tried to find and reacquire. There was only a handful of items left that had eluded me all these decades. But in my Stegron video, I showed the beach towels, and in my Solving Ancient Mysteries video, I showed the Flaming Vader poster and the Avon Command module from 1980. Well, that left only 2 items. A book that I couldn't remember the name of and took 36 years to find. Terra. And finally, this Y&T piece of glass. I even downloaded all their albums from YouTube and listened to them for the first time, and I actually like the band. Well, is there anything left for me to hunt for? Anything left to find? A holy grail, if you will? Not really. But I did find a number of items that update my previous videos. Adding to my Greatest American Hero video, I have these 3D printed and hand-painted replicas of the exceptionally rare final action figures released from the Mego Toy Company. Adding to my Dungeons & Dragons video, I have this copy of my first foray into that world, the 1982 Endless Quest book, Mountain of Mirrors, signed by cover artist Larry Elmore and interior artist Jim Holloway. Adding to my Stegron video, I have this French reprint of the issues, including the artwork from the beach towel, and something even more interesting. I found someone else online that also had a fascination with this character because they too had a piece of merchandise from the late 70s with this mystery character on it, and they didn't know where he came from. But it wasn't the beach towel like me, it was this. Presto Magics. Remember these? Adding to my Battle of the Planets video, I have this vintage advertisement to get American television stations to purchase and run the series, featuring the American creation 7's-Arc-7. And I got this Phoenix model that I have to build. Adding to the 50 books of my childhood, I have that aforementioned Terra. And last but not least, I have an addition to my Throw Mama from the Orient Express video. After all these years of the COVID pandemic raging on, the sequel to Murder on the Orient Express with Kenneth Branagh has finally been released, Death on the Nile. And this time, I recreated the experience from the first video, but in reverse order, starting by reading the book from my mom's collection. Then I watched the original version of the film from 1978, which was actually a sequel to the original 1974 Orient Express. Then the 2004 BBC television version that my mom loves the best. And then I took my mom to see the new Death on the Nile in the theater for her 71st birthday. And in my opinion, which is always right, Kenneth Branagh should win Best Director of the Year. Movie's awesome! Okay, well, back to Frank Frazetta. You see, in 1995, he moved down here to Boca Grande, Florida, and opened up his first museum. But then he immediately had a stroke, the first of 7, and had to close it back up and move back to Pennsylvania for care. At 67 years old, he lost the ability of his right hand, his painting and drawing hand. But then he taught himself how to paint with his left hand. And that's where I thought he was in 2009 when I was reading about his Poconos museum being broken into, paintings being stolen, but I didn't know that his wife Ellie had just died and Frank moved back down here to Boca Grande to live with his daughter Holly on the beach and not be alone. It was at this time that Image Comics started putting out these comic books featuring original stories based on his paintings. And Frank actually signed many of them. And they would be the last things that he signed. I don't have any with his signature, but I do have 2 signed by interior artist Tim Vigil. Then on July 7th, 2013, at the Miami Airport Convention Center, in the last few minutes of the final day of the SuperCon comic book convention, I saw a woman packing up her table full of stuff that I recognized to be Frank's daughter, Holly. I bought this shirt from her. She was surprised I knew who she was. This was her very first public appearance. Later that year, I got the book Art and Remembrance by Frank Frazetta Jr., who now runs the museum in the Poconos and is no longer in trouble for breaking into it. And I also got this limited print of The Reign of Wizardry, signed by Frank Jr. After that, Holly and her daughter Sarah created the company Frazetta Girls and had their debut at MegaCon in Orlando, where I saw them on March 23rd, 2014, and I got this limited print of Conan the Adventurer, that first oil painting paperback book cover, signed by Holly, Sarah, and Frank's other granddaughters, Brittany and Rachel. When I saw Holly and Sarah a few months later at the Tampa Bay Comic-Con on August 3rd, I got from them a dual-signed copy of the new book, The Definitive Reference, and this limited print of my absolute favorite Frazetta painting of all time, Death Dealer 2, also signed by both of them. The following month, on September 14th at the Fanboy Expo, I was wearing my Death Dealer 2 shirt when I got myself 3D scanned for the first time. And I got the dual-signed Book 1. And on December 7th, they came right to my town to exhibit some of Frank's original artwork at the Howell Gallery in Fort Myers, which I attended and filmed, as well as getting my dual-signed limited edition print of the Fire and Ice painting. And on February 16, 2016, at the Shock Pop Comic-Con, they had the Fire and Ice reunion, where I got to meet voice actors Sean Hannon, who played Necron, Maggie Roswell, who played Tigra, and screenplay writers Jerry Conway and Roy Thomas, as well as animator Steve Gordon and Ralph Bakshi's son, who I bought this original pencil drawing signed by his father, Ralph Bakshi, that was used in the making of Fire and Ice. Then a few months back, on December 20th, 2021, Spectrum Fantasy Art Quarterly Volume 1 was released with an interview with Sarah Frazetta, and she announced the reopening of the Boca Grande Museum, the first museum that Frank had in 1995. For 1 month in February of 2022, available by appointment only, you could be one of the few to go. And my daughter and I got the chance to go just 3 days after Frank's 94th birthday. We were there for 5 hours. I got to see his work in person. I got to look at the back of a Frank Frazetta painting. I got to spend time with his family, hold his paintbrushes, smell his oil paint tubes, touch his art table, touch his art chair. I got to play pinball with his daughter. I looked through his personal photo albums while listening to his favorite classical music. I got to see artwork that's never been seen by the public.
This will be a day long remembered.
This year brings us new things to look forward to. I've pre-ordered the new upcoming Death Dealer comic book and action figure from Frazetta Girls in association with Incendium, and a new hardcover book signed by Frank Jr. of the complete chronological collection of his book covers. And I was able to get the crowning piece to my collection. After being blown away by the original pen and ink Beauty and the Beast artwork at the Frank Frazetta Museum in Boca Grande, I got a vintage limited print of it, hand signed and numbered by Frank Frazetta himself. Yes, he touched this. He wrote on this. Oh, one last thing. Years ago, I wrote and drew a webcomic for a long time called Kevin's World, all about me and my family and friends. Well, Frank Frazetta painted the cover to a book called Kevin's World. Oh, it says Caven's World. Hey, close enough. And a new hardcover book of his 1983 film he made of the sitting in my work truck in front of an abandoned